Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in the 2024 Climate Action webinar from Griffith University's Climate Action Beacon. This webinar is being jointly brought to you by Griffith's Climate Action Beacon and Griffith Asia Institute. I'm joined today by colleagues Professor Christopher Nedapal Wang, who's Director of Griffith Asia Institute, Lilia Ben Deckhill, who's a Griffith Law, doing a double degree in Law and Environmental Science. And she was also a Global Voices Fellow to COP29. And also welcome to Dr. Kate Dooley, who's ARC DECRA Senior Research Fellow in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, University of Melbourne. In this webinar, we're going to be discussing the outcomes of COP29, with a bit of a focus on looking at the outcomes in relation to the mitigation gap, mobilising climate finance, the rules for carbon trading, and what was done addressing the climate-nature nexus, and what this all means in terms of achieving the Paris Agreement long-term temperature goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and really securing a livable planetary climate for all. Let me begin by acknowledging the Yaga Rabul, Jugara, Jagara, Turrbal, Yugame, Kumanberi peoples, who are the traditional custodian owners of whose land the 5 Griffith University campuses are located on, and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I would like to begin by sharing with you some results of our latest National Climate Action Survey. This survey is undertaken, we've been undertaking it annually for a few years now. It's led by, there's the project team, Carly and Pass, Graham Bradley, Samir Deshpande, Kerry Foxwell Norden, and myself. The survey is quite a large one. It's a sample of about 400,000 people that are selected by a company we engage to be demographically representative of Australian society. And it's designed by the structure of it, if you like, is designed by Graham Bradley, who's a social psychologist, and Samir and Kerry, who are communication experts. And the content of the questions, if you like, are also informed by domain experts that we bring in. If you go to that QR code, it'll take you to a website where there's a document called the Summary for Decision Makers, and also a more detailed technical report. But I just wanted to bring some high-level results from that, because it helps set the scene for what we're talking about today. So one of the questions is very simply, or there's a set of questions that relate to what Australians think about climate change, and do they think climate change is a real phenomenon? Well, when you ask that question, you get this result: 82% of Australians accept that climate change is happening. That's the kind of survey result you get from various polls and other surveys that are done by other organisations in Australia. And our survey drills down a bit more. If you ask Australians should Australia set a national target of national net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest, you find there's good support for that from all Australians, and even a majority amongst LNP, or people who intend or have voted or intend to vote LNP, and a bit stronger in Labor Party. But what if we asked Australians, do we think we have a climate crisis? 82% of them might think that they accept climate change is happening, but do they think we have a climate crisis? Well, actually, only 15% think it's an extremely serious problem now. And if we ask them if they think it'll be a serious problem in the future, actually only 34% think it will be an extremely serious problem by 2050. So we have here a major gap. This is the first of a number of gaps we're going to talk about today. 82% of Australians accept that it's happening, but only 15% think it's an extremely serious problem now. Right? So most Australians want climate action, if you like, but perhaps not too much. And when you ask them what are the reasons for not engaging even more generally in environmentally friendly behaviours, you get these kind of responses. A third think they're just too busy or they don't have enough time. About 30% think these actions might be too expensive. There's a range of reasons there. Actions are not going to stop or solve our problems. The actions are too inconvenient, too much effort. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it, how to engage with. They're not a priority for me. I never seem around to get to do them. The problems are too great for me or any individual to have any impact. I don't trust the authorities that give out information, etc. So Australians accept that climate change is real, it's a problem, but they've got other things in their minds, other things going on in their lives that perhaps prevent barriers to climate action and that put the urgency of the situation a bit to the rear. But what are the science and data telling us? What's the science and data telling us where we're at regarding this climate change problem? Well, this is from the latest Global Carbon Project for 2024, which is the authoritative reporting on greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see here, as the graph shows, there's time on the bottom from 1960 to 2024, and the vertical axis is the gigatons of fossil fuel CO2 emissions. And you can see it's virtually still a straight line. The estimates for this year are about 37.5 gigaton, which is 1 billion tons of CO2. There's a bit of a dip with COVID and whenever we have a global financial crisis, but to use the term that became very familiar during COVID, we are not bending the curve. We are a long way from reaching peak. Well, we've not yet reached peak global emissions, and to achieve net zero emissions, that curve not only has to flatten, but decline equally down the other side. I've got the cover pages from two reports there. The first is the most recent IPCC assessment of what mitigation effort is needed to limit global warming. And the second is a document that came out in preparation for this year's COP29, which is the synthesis of the mitigation outcomes that would arise when you aggregate together all the commitments or contributions the world's governments have said they would do under their nationally determined contributions. We talk about, that's abbreviated to NDCs, nationally determined contributions. They're the contributions that governments have said they're going to make in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and 2050. Well, the IPCC science concluded that to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, with more than 50% likelihood by 2100, greenhouse gas emissions have to be reduced by 43% by 2030 relative to 2019 level. So that's the science-based target. We need 43% reduction by 2030 compared to 2019. If we want to limit warming to 2 degrees, we've got a less strict target, but emissions still have to be reduced by 27% below the 2019 level by 2030. What does the UNFCCC synthesis report tell us? If we were to fully implement, if the latest nationally determined contributions in terms of their mitigation effort, their policies and proposed programs were to be fully implemented, this would result in only a 5.9% emission reduction by 2030 relative to 2019. So let's call that 6%. The science is telling us we need 43%, and current government policies is 6%. So that's called a mitigation gap. It's the gap between what the science tells us we have, how much we have to mitigate, and what governments are currently committed to do. And there's another qualifier there. Implementation of all latest NDCs, excluding any conditional elements, is estimated to result in actually a 1% higher emission. Now, conditional elements are developing countries, economically developing countries, who have been least responsible for the emissions to date, are saying, if you want us to transition to clean energy going forward, you need to help finance that or fund that. So their mitigation commitments are conditional on getting climate finance. In the absence of that, we're going to be 1% higher. So what this means in terms of global warming is that the very best we could expect is actually to end up by 2100 pretty well close to 3 degrees, after which temperatures would continue to rise. So I guess the shorthand story here is that the mitigation gap, if it's not closed in the coming years, puts us on track to a 3-degree world. Why is that important? Well, that's because with every increment of global warming, it escalates climate risks. And this is a table from the IPCC report, actually for our region. I'll just use it to illustrate one point. If we go to the top left bars, these bars represent levels of risk in colour, from undetectable to very high, against degrees of global warming, 0 to 4 degrees. And there are 2 bars for low adaptation and moderate adaptation. The risk here is the risk of loss of and degradation of coral reefs in Australia. Think the Great Barrier Reef. And you can see by the time you get to 1.5 degrees, you're at the very highest risk. And whether you've got a lower, and you've passed the limits of adaptation. There's no more human interventions that we can do to mitigate those, to avoid those risks. And basically, when you're around 2 degrees to 3 degrees, everything is at the highest level of risk. Even things for which adaptation is still possible at 1.5 and 2 degrees, such as agriculture. So heading to a 3-degree world puts us in a very bad place. So we have very precious time left, and we'll need heroic levels of emission reduction to limit ourselves to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. The diagram on the left is just indicating we've got, with current emissions continue, we've got 6 years till we breach 1.5 degree carbon budget. And on the right-hand side, it just shows you how steeply emissions have to be reduced from now if we're to limit warming to 1.5, 1.7 or 20 degrees. So this brings us to the COP. What was the purpose of the Climate COP29? Well, for those of you who aren't familiar, the climate change conferences take place every year, and it's the place, it's the only multilateral decision-making forum on climate change that brings together just about every country on Earth. There's a couple of countries who haven't signed up. COP29 stands for the 29th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, parties being national governments. And that's abbreviated to UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that was the landmark treaty signed in 1992. And under that was negotiated the Paris Agreement in 2015. So each year, what the COPs are doing are negotiating decisions to now implement the Paris Agreement, which was an accord agreed to, if you like, an action plan agreed to under the Framework Convention. So for COP29, there were a number of key agenda items that were being negotiated. The first was this issue of climate finance. The second is what was called a global stock take. The third, Article 6, and the fourth, Nature Climate Nexus. So climate finance, people were talking about trillions of dollars being needed, and there were for developing countries to have climate resilient development and also to rapidly transit to net zero emissions. The global stock take was about looking at the nationally determined contributions and whether they were going to help close the mitigation gap we just talked about, and also how we can advance more quickly the transition away from fossil fuel. Article 6 is about carbon trading rules between governments, but also the use of markets or non-market approaches. And the nature-climate nexus is because our climate change problem is intimately connected to our natural environment, and the Convention on Biological Diversity at their most recent COP this year made another important decisions about the need for more collaboration between those two treaties. So that's the introduction and context I wanted to give to explain to you that, as I've showed with these slides, Australians accept that climate change is real, that they've got a lot on their mind, and it's not seen as such an urgent problem as what the science is telling us it is. The science is pretty clear that we're really at this critical junction in the coming decade about where we end up. And if we continue on the current course to a 3-degree world, the science is also pretty clear what the consequences of that are. So given all of that, and that the Climate COP29 that was held in Baku, Azerbaijan, is concluded, what were the outcomes? So this is where I would like to turn to our panelists. And I'm just going to get out of my PowerPoint, and I think I will also stop sharing. And perhaps because we're all talking virtually in different rooms, perhaps when I turn to each of our panelists, I'll just ask each of them to share their screen so that they can hear my voice and you can be seeing them rather than me. So first up, so just to say from here, I'm going to speak to each of our 3 panelists in turn for 10 or 15 minutes each. And then there'll be plenty of time after that for all of you listening and watching to ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the top. If you could post your questions in there, we'll be doing our best to answer them. But to begin, I wanted to turn to Lilia. So Lilia, if you wanted to share your screen so that we could all see you.
I think I've managed to spotlight myself, so hopefully it should be on the main screen.
You have. Hi, welcome. So Lilia, you're undergraduate student at Griffith University. So tell us, how did you get to be a delegate to COP29?
Well, thank you, Professor Mackey, for your question, for inviting me to this webinar series. So I attended COP29 in the capacity as a fellow for an Australian youth-led not-for-profit organisation called Global Voices. A bit of background on the organisation itself. Global Voices supports students to have an opportunity with practical experience in policy making, international relations, and diplomacy. It's a non-partisan and non-advocacy organisation. So rather than attending COP29 as a standalone experience, it's actually one of the 3 components of the Global Voices Fellowship Programme. The other 2 components being a set of pre-departure trainings, which was an upskilling program where we met with academics and government departmental representatives in Canberra and received media training. And the second component being a policy proposal, so developing a policy which proposes practical recommendations on a topic related to the delegation agenda, in my case being COP. So the idea was that I used my first-hand delegation experience at COP to help develop my policy idea further.
Okay. So tell us about what happened at the COP, and were you part of the Australian government delegation?
Thank you. So yeah, I was very fortunate to be on an Australian government party overflow badge, which meant I was able to get access to different rooms, spaces at COP. This was my first time attending COP, so it can be a rather overwhelming and daunting space to be in, particularly if you're not a seasoned COP attendee. So was grateful for the support and structure provided me while I was over there. At COP itself, we were feel free to explore different areas such as the delegations pavilion, side events, and plenary hall meetings, and also had access to the negotiation rooms, which was a really great opportunity to follow along some of the negotiation streams and see how debates evolved over the first and second week. Peppered throughout our time at COP, we also had a number of bilateral meetings with individuals and organizations such as the Honourable Josh Wilson, Assistant Minister for Climate Change and Energy, and directors from Australia's chapter of the Climate Action Network, otherwise known as CANA, and were facilitated to connect with other youth delegates there, such as Italy's Young Ambassador of Society and UNICEF Australia. What I personally did at COP myself, so although this year was kind of branded as the big finance COP, as a law and environmental science student, I naturally found myself drawn to more of the pavilion showcases and side events which focused on climate change, biodiversity, and international law. The Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion at COP29, which was the collective pavilion for Pacific Island states, had a number of greater side events which considered youth-driven climate justice and enabling innovative climate policy. COPs are generally a busy time of year for all involved, particularly with the biodiversity COP happening only a few weeks prior. But this year in particular being a busy time in the climate justice space as countries, well, we're at the time of COP29 preparing to take the stage at The Hague for oral submissions on the International Court of Justice, the ICJ's advisory opinion proceedings on climate change, and believe that proceeding was actually brought about by the idea and work of youth in Vanuatu. So it was really special at COP to hear from and speak with some incredible youth delegates, particularly at the Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion. One event in particular which stood out to me was called the Witness Stand, in which one by one youth from a number of Pacific Island countries got up and spoke as if they were speaking to members of the ICJ, kind of delivering their own oral submissions, if you will. Additionally, it was also great to hear from the Attorney General of Fiji, Mr. Graham Luong, who provided more details on the oral submission process. For instance, each country has a limited time, about 30 minutes, to deliver their address to the court. And the order of proceedings, for instance, Fiji would be giving its submissions after country states like the US, so kind of the implications of the order and structure of proceedings. I suppose a surprising moment from COP for me was that I was a little surprised by the lack of these international legal developments, such as the ICJ and the International Law of the Sea Tribunal proceedings being discussed in COP in bigger spaces. So, other than being discussed at delegation pavilions, similarly, how nature wasn't an entirely prominent agenda in the negotiations. I attended one event in which Mr. Manuel Pulgar Vidal, who was Peru's Minister of Environment and served as the president for COP20, described the need for nature negotiations as climate's secret ally, and I entirely agree with that statement. I suppose when you have an interest or work in this space, the synergy between climate and nature seem extremely obvious. But it was interesting to learn about the work being done to bridge the gap between the UNFCCC framework as well as the Convention on Biological Diversity. I suppose one step forward at the COP was that the World WWF, put forth a proposal for UNFCCC Convention on Biological Diversity Joint Work Program on Climate and Nature, and that would follow the model of the mitigation and just transition work programs that are currently being implemented under the UNFCCC. I'm happy to be corrected, but don't believe this was formalized in a covered decision at COP29, but maybe and hopefully will be tabled for discussion and have more seat at the table at COP30 in Brazil next year. Although I suppose it's a little disappointing to know the actual gaps or lack of agenda items at COP29, it was equally enlightening to understand the mechanisms of COP and how different groups or topic areas work in silos. I personally think that one of the main problems that afflicts the current regime on climate change is the disconnect between stakeholders and different interests. I mean, we can see and feel the consequences, as Professor Mackey outlined before, of the fragmented climate governance architecture which we're working with. I suppose that was a kind of a big picture overview of how I came to attend COP and what I did, but happy to share a little more on my reflections of COP as a process and takeaway from this year's COP, if that's okay, Professor Mackey?
Yes, please do. Yep.
Perfect. So, as a starting point for my perceptions on COP, I think the whole COP process can seem a little bit indecipherable to those not familiar with or who are not in the space. While the what of COP is known, so that it's the primary decision-making body of the UNFCCC and it's kind of a biannual meeting point for parties to the convention, I think there still remains an air of foreignness of what lies under this veil because breakthrough decisions and big texts aren't being decided or agreed upon at every minute. So it leaves the general public wondering what goes on the rest of the time in this 2 week conference period. As one does, I researched to try to prepare myself of what I was walking into, a COP crash course, if you will. But it was actually during the pre-departure briefings I attended in which one pithy description of COP as an annual opera stuck with me. After sitting with this thought, I came to find the analogy to be a compelling way to frame my anticipation of attending. At first, you might ask yourself, like I did, what, if any, are the similarities between theatre and an international climate summit? But when you consider just the elements such as orchestration, backstage dynamics, a climax, and resolution, you realize that their anatomies are actually quite similar. It might take a few moments now just to kind of tease apart this analogy. So, in terms of orchestration, COP meetings are a grand performance. They're carefully orchestrated with a range of actors from government delegates, representatives of civil society, and non-governmental organizations, and they're all performing their assigned parts. So while each actor may have rehearsed their pre-written script, as you will, such as a government negotiator knowing what their absolute bottom line is, the outcomes of COP, as with any live performance, can be unpredictable. With respect to the backstage dynamics, as with live performances, there's also a world happening behind the curtains, and COP meetings mirror this with loads of closed session negotiation happening between the different sub-delegation groups. To the public, we hear and see of these grand announcements of major steps forward, but the outcomes on the main stage, in this case being the plenary hall meetings, they're often the result of backstage dynamics, including private and impromptu side meetings. In terms of climax and resolution, every opera has a climax, and so too does COP. In the first week of the conference, the rhythm's a little bit slower. There's foundational discussions being held, positions being stated. But as the second week approaches, the tempo picks up and builds to, I guess, a crescendo of possibility. But when the curtain closes on COP, or in this case COP29, it's not truly the end, as no opera finishes with a final note. The reverberations continue and shape the next act, the next COP, and the next set of efforts to address climate change. I hope that analogy wasn't too far-fetched, but I myself found it helpful in preparing for COP and really trusting in the process that there's a learnable moment in even the most unfamiliar melody. My perceptions on COP, including the negotiations, matured and changed after attending. From those outside of the COP space, I think it's easy and perhaps a tendency to look at COP success through a binary lens, whether it's a success or whether it's a failure. But as I came to understand while at COP and since coming home, that the dichotomy is not always constructive and instead simplifies the complexities of a consensus-driven approach like the UNFCCC. Yes, progress is painstakingly slow and the outcomes can fall short of the ambition we desperately need, but it's dismissing COP altogether, I think, risks ceding the space to those who seek to obstruct progress, letting them define the narrative. A remark I overheard at COP that struck a chord with me was name and fame rather than name and shame. And walking through the delegation pavilions, I really felt the energy and dedication of participants. many people were there because they care deeply, because they have something vital to say, or because they want to learn and contribute. So although it's easy to be cynical about COP, there are people in the space who care deeply and working to push the needle forward, albeit it needs to be at a faster speed. I think that's a general consensus of those working in the climate space. But that gives me hope, and not necessarily a naive hope, but the kind grounded in action, persistence, and collective will. So yeah, those are my COP reflections.
Thanks, Celia. I think thank you for those very thoughtful and I think insightful reflections on the COP. I think what you've said is very helpful too, because the Australian government is still manoeuvring and negotiating to try and be the host country for COP31 in the year after Brazil, and we're in competition with Turkey for that, which is people might wonder, how did that come to be? Well, in the UN climate system, Australia's lumped in with Western Europe or with Europe, and regions take turn to host the COP. So both Australia and Turkey have put their hand up. But a lot of us, oh no, stay there, I haven't finished with you yet. and a lot of Australians are debating whether, should Australia bother hosting a COP? It's expensive. Is it going to be used against the government? Are people going to, say it's a waste of time and money, etc.? So given your experiences at COP29, what's your thoughts on the benefit and value to Australia if it were to succeed in hosting a COP in a couple of years' time?
I think for me personally, that the primary benefit of Australia hosting a COP would be that it's proposing to co-host the COP with the Pacific. I think given that Pacific Island states are very vocal in the climate space, not only in COP in the negotiations, which I was pleasantly surprised by, but also in bringing big issues to big places, such as the ICJ and the Law of the Sea Tribunal. I think the benefit or hope for Australia hosting COP31 in 2026 is that it would be a genuine partnership, hopefully between the Pacific, and kind of shed light on regional issues. As you mentioned, the last few years, COP spotlight hasn't been in this area, and I think it would be a natural progression. We have these big decisions that will be coming from the ICJ and the Law of the Sea Tribunal, that it's kind of an extension, flow on, or trickle down effect.
Great, thank you. Look, thanks very much, Lilia. That was a great contribution to today's discussion. So I might turn now to our next panelist, Christoph. If I could ask you to share your screen. Can you do a share screen thing, Christoph?
I don't have any screen to share, but I'm on camera, if that's helpful.
Yeah, well, it's put on speaker mode, so I think everyone can see you as the main speaker, which is the main thing.
All right.
So that's good. So, Christoph, this was referred to as the Climate Finance COP. So why was that, and what is climate finance, and why is it important?
Right. Thanks so much, Brendan. And it's very tough to come after Lilia. I mean, she's just been kind of painting such a great picture of her experience at COP. Thanks so much, Lilia, really, for sharing it. And it's very hard to come after her, particularly since she used this beautiful metaphor of music and an opera. I really enjoyed that. That was great. Really kind of brought the message home. To your question, Brendan. So thanks, first of all, of course, everybody for attending. I think it's a important topic, and we had, I'm also pleased to say we had this, Brendan, if you remember last year, after COP, we also organized a very similar session between the Climate Action Beacon and the Griffith Asia Institute. Now, climate finance typically kind of, I think, is particularly around COP understood as mobilizing more money to address mitigation, so reduce the kind of industries and sectors, impacts on emissions, but also adaptation. Over the last years, it's been, of course, very strongly still on mitigation, because I think the kind of the science is clear. If you don't reduce emissions significantly, all adaptation efforts will just be kind of a bottomless pit, because we're just going to have more and more climate change, and we don't even know what to adapt to. So I think that's why it's also has been very natural to focus climate finance so much on mitigation, while we should not forget adaptation. And that's not the only definition of climate finance. In commercial finance, we talk much more about climate risks and understanding climate risk and reducing our exposure to climate risks. But again, that's not really COP. COP is very much about mobilizing different kind of finance from different sources. And so we had over the last, how long? Since 2009, we had actually our first goal to mobilize climate finance. The goal that was set in 2009 was to mobilize $100 billion annually, in addition to existing development finance, from developed countries to emerging economies. The time frame was set that by 2020, this $100 billion should be reached. And the interesting aspect, of course, is that all dreams have a deadline. So 2020 was the start year, and 2020 this agreement was valid until 2025. So it became clear that it's time to actually, with 2025 being next year, we need a new agreement. We need a new agreement what type of climate finance and mobilization from developed countries in particular to developing countries is needed. So they came up with a very complicated and hard to remember name. So I do expect everybody after this beautiful seminar to remember it. It's a new collective quantified goal on climate finance, also short NCQG. So it's a the goal is kind of, there was a lot of discussions around this, kind of how much it should be. The final outcome was to have at least $300 billion of climate finance by 2035. And the question is, of course, is that good or bad? So we had 120 billion in 2022. That is the latest number that is available. So we have reached officially our goal, but is 300 billion by 2035 really good? Now, I would say most developed countries would say it was a pretty crappy deal. Some said it's a joke, many said it's a betrayal. So that's kind of what the emerging economies are saying. And the demand is kind of, because it falls very short of the demand that was kind of coming from the G70 bloc. So that's a bloc of countries that is less developed, that is developing countries plus China pretty much. And they had demanded a goal of $1.3 trillion by 2035. So 1.3 trillion per year in climate finance by 2035. And so now we have the 300 billion agreement versus the 1.3 trillion goal. And I think to understand that, whether it's good or bad, let's look at also some of kind of where we've come from and kind of where we are and where we hope to go. As I said, kind of we had $100 billion. It's important to understand that the last numbers with the $120 billion in 2022, 2/3 of that money, of the $120 billion, was given as not as grants or concessional loans, but as kind of private finance. So it's finance mobilization. That's what kind of the term for it is. So that commercial finance and grants mobilize private sector finance. And I think that's very tricky definition to start with, but it's an important definition. We always talk about blended finance, kind of how can the public sector and the development banks mobilize private sector capital by de-risking specific types of investments. So kind of that's how we got to this $120 billion. 2/3 of it is pretty much commercial finance. Now, we are already at 120 billion. Now, if we extrapolate inflation until 2035, this 120 billion would be already $220 billion. So we're already more than 2/3 on the way to our 300 billion goals just by kind of continuing exactly what we've been doing just by having inflation. So from that perspective, it's potentially not ambitious as well. And of course, it's not sufficient to invest in a lot of the activities that we need to decarbonize. I think another contentious issue was the role of developing countries like China. Now, we will publish actually tomorrow a study with together with a Chinese government institutions to understand the climate finance flows from China since 2003, so over the last 20 years. And China has always been, for example, a very big contributor to climate finance, not always, but over the last years, it's actually the 8th largest contributor to climate finance in the world. Should China be included in this? Has always been the question. Other countries like India as well in this goal. And kind of the way it's structured right now to have the 300 billion goals, it's the official way. It's kind of it's encouragement for developing countries to contribute to development funding. It's encouragement. But what's the motivation is the big question, because if they help to reach a 300 billion dollar goal, developed countries like the European Union, Australia, and of course the US have even less reason to contribute funding. So it's, I think, a tricky incentive structure for countries like China and India that will definitely I'm pretty sure not give up on investing in a lot of these technologies just because it's also very advantageous for them commercially, but of course also to fight climate change. There's also the lack of definition. What is the climate finance additionality? So we have a number of sustainable development goals, 17, and climate is just one of them. We have also important considerations like gender equality, social development, education, health. So how does the 300 billion that we've already agreed, which is a low target, impact the other development finance streams? And there has been no agreement on the definition of what is the additionality around this. The accountability is equally not properly defined. How often do we have to report? What is exactly our definition? Who's contributing what? So around the accountability, there has been a lot of criticism, and it's pretty weak around this. And just to also put this $300 billion a year into perspective. Anybody knows for a second how much profits BHP makes per year? Our Australian good old mining company. What's the profits of BHP per year? Now it's about $20 to $30 billion. So it's about 8 to 10% of that goal already. Just one company makes that much profit, not revenues, profit. If you look at Apple, that makes 14 billion profits in a quarter. And if you look at NVIDIA, that makes $19 billion profits in a quarter. So just to put this $300 billion into perspective of our global economy, it's pretty it's important, and I think it's a lot of money, but in terms of the global economy, it's not a lot of, not so much money as we sometimes believe. So next steps, I think it's important to really rebuild trust in negotiations. My reading is there has been a lot of trust being lost, also particularly from the developed countries towards the developing countries. Australia can play an important role, must play an important role, particularly with the ambition to host COP31. There has been a new initiative called the Barco do Belém Roadmap to 1.3 trillion. So Belém is the next COP in Brazil, and so there is a working group and initiative around this to better define this goal, have more ambitious goal. And I just want to end by saying of course looking at a higher level, is that goal good or bad? We always have to remember politics, and COP is politics. Politics is the art of understanding what's possible. And of course, it's disheartening that not more was possible, that this is the ambition of the world in terms of the possibilities of mobilizing more climate finance. But we also have to understand that this COP has been under extremely difficult political circumstances, also with kind of Azerbaijan not being potentially the most active presidency, the Trump election. So under this circumstance, it's better potentially to have an agreement to move forward to build on, than no agreement at all and kind of seeing the process breaking down.
Thanks, Christoph. That was very helpful in terms of understanding those many multitudinous dimensions to climate finance. In terms of Australia and climate finance, what's our role as an economically developed country? The last time I looked, we were still had the 14th biggest GDP in the world, interestingly about the same size as Russia's. So presumably we're a major player in, are we a major player in the climate finance world?
Not a major player. It's not typically Australia coming up. I think Australia's role is much stronger in specific regional initiatives. So of course, Pacific and Asia Pacific, where a lot of climate finance is needed. Obviously, climate finance comes in various different forms. It can be capacity building, which I think DFAT is very strongly engaged in, to build capacity, how to address climate change, how to mobilize climate finance. It comes in terms of technical assistance. Kind of planning energy systems, planning a transition, and of course also kind of a lot of climate finance, and actually the largest part is also in really investing in specific type of projects where really the mobilization of finance can play a key role. Kind of to give you a simple example, why should the Australian government fully support a renewable energy plant somewhere in an emerging economy, which is actually mostly financially viable because it generates a profit. So the goal is much more kind of to use slices of these funds to kind of bring down the cost of capital for private investors and blend that money, so blended finance, to invest in kind of actual projects around mitigation. But Australia is an important player, but again, not in the top-notch players.
Yeah. So you raise a point there, just a final question for you. You raise a point there about, using public funds to mobilize private investment for, clean energy infrastructure for mitigation. Is it true to say that it's more likely for that to happen, for private investment to be going into mitigation solutions versus adaptation solutions? Is there more?
I think that's a generally fair assessment. Private sector and blended finance is typically used in projects that generate cash flows, because you have to pay back and kind of return to investors. Private investors have a single mind: where do I get profits? And profits are by having a return on the project. And typically, mitigation projects in renewable energy, in particular, are cash flow generating, depending kind of how well they're structured, how much cash flow. Whereas adaptation projects, it's a lot more tricky at this point in time to really generate substantial scalable cash flows, and therefore mobilize private sector investments. It's not possible. We know of many projects where it's possible as well, but I think it's definitely more on the public finance space.
Right. So on the adaptation side, would there be a business model that would be based around like the avoided costs and reduced insurance costs or something like this? Could there be? Do you know of any work around that area in terms of climate finance adaptation, trying to come up with business models that make sense to a private investor?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of an often cited example, which is also nice, is kind of to use, for example, mangroves to reduce the risk of floods, which many developers need to consider flood risks, whether it's from any types of waterways, rivers, but also, of course, oceans. So reducing the risk of floods is part of the building code. It's part of the requirements. You can use kind of technical solutions, concrete blocks, or you can, of course, use natural solutions that then, of course, again, provide adaptation and mitigation efforts, because mangroves have a very high absorption capacity of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. So these would be opportunities for private investors to be encouraged to actually invest in adaptation as well.
Okay, thanks for that. I'll now move to our third panelist, Kate. So if Kate can maybe, Kate, do you need some help from Natasha? Oh no, I think Christoph is no longer the speaker role.
No, I don't need help. Can you, no, maybe Christoph has to unspotlight himself. In my screen, he's still spotlighted.
Yes. Can you unspotlight yourself, Christoph, please? Thank you. So welcome, Kate. So thanks for joining us today. So there's a set of related issues here. I think if we've got time, I'd like to talk about the global stocktake, but I know that you've got a particular interest and expertise around Article 6. So perhaps we could begin with that. Perhaps you could explain what Article 6 is. You know, what's it an article of?
Yeah, sure.
And why it's important.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a really interesting discussion so far. I think to understand Article 6, it's helpful to go back a little bit. To start with, why is it? So Article 6 is the carbon trading and carbon markets, as well as non-market approaches in the Paris Agreement. And it's called Article 6 because it's the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement where these approaches are included. But it's helpful to go back a little bit to that. So the mandate for even actually negotiating the Paris Agreement came in 2012 at the Durban COP, and that was the mandate to negotiate a new global agreement, and that included negotiations on new market mechanisms and non-market approaches and a framework. And so these negotiations went on for a couple of years leading up to Paris, but they never actually reached any outcomes or agreements. So at every COP between Durban in 2012 and Paris in 2015, we just had a complete collapse of carbon market negotiations because countries couldn't even agree on whether there should be carbon markets in the Paris Agreement. Then they were included in that sort of same format. So we have Article 6.2, which is internationally traded mitigation outcomes, but it means bilateral trades between countries. And then Article 6.4, which is a centralized trading mechanism. And Article 6.8, which is non-market approaches. So in Paris, they were included in that agreement, but in a quite vague form because countries still didn't really agree whether there should be carbon trading. So they weren't called carbon trading as such, but mitigation outcomes. And then since then, it has continued to be really difficult to negotiate Article 6 and the rules around these carbon trading mechanisms. So when most of what was called the rulebook for the Paris Agreement was concluded in 2017, nothing on carbon markets. It wasn't until the COP29 in Madrid ran over by 2 days, and there was again no outcome on carbon markets. There were disagreements over how to define the rules, and it wasn't until Glasgow that there was really some consolidation of what the rules around this would be. And then again, we had several COPs with no agreement on further details of the rules until this COP29 in Baku. So many people are hailing this as kind of an historic COP, an historic decision, because it is the first time we've ever had an agreed global carbon market that all countries can participate in. Usually when something is hailed as historic, it's considered a good thing. I don't think this agreement on carbon markets should be welcomed, and for several reasons. So as I said, there's been a lot of controversy amongst countries on how to even agree this. But in particular, what's happened at this COP is we've seen the agreement that's come out on carbon markets is weaker than what was rejected at the last few COPs. So the rules actually had to go backwards and become very weak before all countries could agree to adopt them. So that's very unfortunate. And to get to some of the specifics, and particularly in relation to nature, what has been happening in the last few COPs is for the Article 6.4, so that's the international centrally traded mechanism. There has been a proposal from that mechanism has a supervisory body, a small group of people from different countries who've put together recommendations for the methodologies and in particular for how removals should be treated. So removals would be carbon sequestered into trees and forests, and also technological removals. So this is a big part of this is expected to become a big part of carbon markets. So this guidance from the supervisory body was rejected at the last two COPs. It was pushed through at this COP with actually no negotiation. It was just announced as kind of done. Tuvalu noted that this was not exactly a party-driven process. And there's still a lot of detail to be further developed in this guidance. So the reason it hadn't been adopted at the last two COPs was in particular because there's no definition of what durability actually means, like how durable, that means permanent. For how long do removals have to be removed to be counted as an offset? There's they still need to develop a risk of reversals tool to understand the different risks of reversals from different kinds of removals, and what the post-crediting monitoring period will be. So for how long after a ton of carbon is removed does it need to be monitored? So those are still open questions. Yet the decision made at this COP means that Article 6.4 with a centralized registry, there should be an interim registry up and ready to run by the end of the year, and the full registry ready by next year. CDM credits from, if people had followed in the past under the Kyoto Protocol, we had the clean development mechanism. So there are still credits from that mechanism that haven't been able to be used since 2020 because the Kyoto Protocol ended. Those credits can be now transferred to this new registry, which means the CDM included credits for reforestation and afforestation. There's a lot of concerns about those credits, and there won't be extra checks that they fit the rules of the new market. They can just be traded. So there's a lot of concerns about this market that's been established, particularly regarding transparency. Countries don't have to make all the reports on their activities that they then put into the registry to trade. They don't necessarily have to make those publicly available. And there are very weak compliance. Well, there is no compliance, so it's misleading to say it's weak. There really are no compliance rules. If inconsistencies are found in countries' credits, they're requested not to use those credits. So it's leaving a lot. It leaves a lot to other countries, but particularly civil society, academics, NGOs, to sort of police the market through raising concerns and naming and shaming countries, which is not a great compliance regime. It's not really the basis for what could be a robust carbon trading initiative. So it will be interesting to watch over the next decade, and the best outcome really would be that that the market it's a voluntary mechanism. Countries don't have to use this. The less they use it, the less it will undermine the Paris Agreement.
Well, thanks, Kate. That was a very succinct and well explained articulation of Article 6 and the problems with the decision that was made. So you were saying Article 6.4, that's the centralised market. So you're saying 6.2 was about bilateral trade between governments. Is that government to government, 6.2? And 6.4, who can trade there? Can anyone?
Essentially anyone. So 6.2 is bilateral trade between governments. So it's government to government. 6.4 is the centralized market. It's primarily for countries to trade. It just means that host parties could place their credits on the market without having to already have found a buyer. Then buyer countries can buy those credits. But it also does include private and public companies can also trade on this market. the registry details aren't in, we don't have the registry yet, so we can't see how it functions, but it looks like parties, so a country is supposed to sort of approve and have an overview of a registry from it that a company or a public, sorry, that a company might have. So there are concerns that there could be double counting here, particularly between the voluntary carbon market, the Article 6.4 and countries' actual tracking progress towards their NDCs, but it will be up to how the registry works to eliminate that double counting.
Right. So could you just explain how the voluntary, or has it been worked out how the voluntary carbon market will relate to Article 6 now, or Article 6.4?
I don't think it's been worked out. There could be other people with more in-depth technical knowledge, but no, I think that's a looming question. And it has been, I feel like part of the agenda or aim of Article 6, perhaps particularly from the Europe, well, not just from Europe, actually, from several countries, has been to eventually merge Article 6.4 with the voluntary carbon market. So the initial idea was that Article 6.4, being a UN, a carbon trading market under the UN, would have higher standards and greater compliance and credibility, and eventually subsume the voluntary carbon market into that, because there's a different varieties of standards there that's considered perhaps a Wild West. And so the idea was that eventually we would have one global UN-backed carbon market standard, and all trades would happen through that. This is like looking some years down the track, perhaps 10. However, the problem with the way the rules were agreed is they are actually weaker now than the leading voluntary carbon market standards. So it's not, I mean, the European Union also wanted stronger rules to be able to use these credits in its ETS, which it closely guards to try and avoid the price crashing. The rules are much weaker than what the European Union wanted. So it's just really, in my opinion, it's unknown how this is going to play out now. I guess the only other thing to say about that is, whilst it's sort of finished and adopted, it's not finished. So the supervisory body has been tasked to further develop rules around baselines, risk of reversals, other things. So in theory, the rules will continue to be tightened up over the next few years, but it's not great when trading can already start at the end of this year.
Yeah, great, thanks. So perhaps just for the benefit of the people we have online who don't have a lot of background in this carbon trading space, I mean, the significance why this is such an important issue is that countries, in meeting their mitigation contributions under their NDCs, they can do that either by some combination of reducing fossil fuel emissions, or reducing emissions from deforestation, degradation, and agriculture, and or by increasing removals into ecosystems, right? So that's the significance of this. The carbon trading would allow a country, for example, to meet some of its mitigation commitment, rather than by reducing emissions, but by buying credits from Papua New Guinea, for example. Is that right?
Yes, that's the idea, because if what happens under Article 6.4 is offsetting, so it means that the country, instead of reducing emissions, can buy, they could buy removals from Papua New Guinea if they planted forests and soaked up carbon. They could also buy reduced emissions if they reduce the emissions through reducing deforestation, for example, or reducing emissions from the energy sector. So there's two types there's reducing emissions and removals that can both be sold as offsets. And I think for me, that's very important to understand, because the removals, particularly removals into land and forests, then there is no actual mitigation value. So there's no benefit to the climate from removals into land and forests if it's used as an offset to allow fossil fuel emissions to continue. There is a benefit if you also reduce emissions. So if Australia reduces its emissions, plants trees, does all of these things, that will help to meet the climate goals. But using removals as an offset it negates the mitigation value of that. And that's why the guidance for removals in 6.4, there was a lot of people pushing for that to be a lot stronger and to actually exclude land-based removals, and that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I think this is a critical point which isn't widely understood, that to get to net zero emissions, we have to both reduce fossil fuel emissions and increase removals. And if you're using one to offset the other, you're not flattening the curve. You might be stopping the curve increasing, but you're not flattening you're not reducing the curve. The curve's got to go down to get to net zero. And as you just said, you need to do that by doing both, by reducing emissions and increasing removals. But this 6.4 mechanism will allow people to offset one against the other. Is that right?
Yes, it will allow offsetting of nature-based removals, which is problematic. It also includes offsetting of geological removals, but that technology is not really developed yet.
Great. So one more question for you. Again, just in terms of thinking about Australia's role in these negotiations, are we a player in the Article 6 negotiations? The Australian government take a particular negotiating position or support a particular one of this Article 6 decisions?
So Australia actually chaired as the co-facilitator of the Article 6.4 negotiations, also participated in the negotiations. From my observations, Australia didn't play a particularly strong role in the negotiations. It seemed often a tussle between the European Union wanting stronger rules, the US wanting much weaker rules, and AOSIS and many AOSIS primarily, and some other sort of small island developing states wanting a more science base to the rules. So that issue we just discussed about removals into land, for example, there was a push from AOSIS for a better science basis.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Now, we do have time for questions. There is an icon at the top of the screen for posting questions in the Q&A. If you could put them in the Q&A and not the chat box, it just makes it easier for us to see them, and also some of the panelists can be answering the ones, with a text response if not verbally. So, are there any questions? And if so, please, well, you can put it in the Q&A, or if you want to, you could even raise your hand if you want to do it that way. Whilst we're waiting for people to think about if they have any questions, I guess a question I had for the three of our panelists was, what happens between now and the next COP, right? So the next COP's in, there are a few questions here. Okay. Christoph, can you read that question there? It says, what are the available sources of financing for the mitigation gap? What roles do banks play in the process? Have banks received sufficient attention and market demand to actively contribute to addressing this gap? And that's kind of a finance question. There's the second question, which is maybe for everyone in your view, or from COP29, what's the most critical strategy for closing the mitigation gap?
Good question. So I think the first question, what are the available financing sources for the mitigation gap? I mean, it's the typical financing sources. We have private capital and from commercial investors that are looking for a financial return. I think it's slightly different where commercial investors go into, whether they are kind of able to manage risks in emerging economies that often have kind of more risk, and that includes often simple risks like foreign exchange risks, but also political risks, and very different from developed countries. So not all commercial investors are willing to go in there. Development finance institutions, both bilateral and multilateral, so like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, have very high, very ambitious climate finance targets. And then, of course, domestic financing is important. And in emerging economies, it's kind of quite tricky, particularly in Asian region, because a lot of financing is needed for state-owned enterprises. Because particularly for mitigation, most of the or a big chunk of the emissions come from state-owned enterprises. Be it the electricity companies like PLN, EVN in China, Power China, Huadian. These are all state-owned electricity companies, but also the mining companies in particularly around the petrostates. Many of those are state-owned enterprises. So how to refinance them to become more green is actually one of the big research questions that we are also trying to answer, and a number of other groups are trying to answer. It's a more complex question because they are often reliant on domestic funding from kind of their governments rather than private capital markets, because they don't have the governance systems. So really big challenge around this, and way too little effort also in the international kind of negotiations around kind of addressing state-owned enterprises.
Thanks. In terms of the second question, to me, this raises one of the issues that came out of COP29, was that in the previous COP, one of the decisions was to phase down fossil fuel, which was historic in that it was the first time since 1992 fossil fuel had been mentioned in a decision, and a commitment to phase it out. But there was, from what I understand, there was no movement on that decision and how it relates to the meeting the mitigation gap, which is what the global stocktake is primarily focused at. So that kind of opens the question as to what happens between now and the next COP, and whether, and I'm talking to Christoph or Kate or Lilia, whether we're going to see some action about the phasing out of fossil fuel. The question is, what's the most critical strategy? Well, there was a decision about phasing down fossil fuel. Do you think we're going to see any action on that between now and into the next COP in Brazil?
I think this comes back to your question about the GST that we didn't get to. Yeah. Because the GST in this COP, so the GST concluded at the last COP, the first GST, and the outcome was the UAE dialogue, which is a 2-year dialogue from last year in UAE to Belém next year. And so that's what they were discussing under the GST. And that didn't reach a conclusion, or there was no decision in those discussions. And one of the reasons was there was no progress on or no agreement to firstly strengthen, but even reaffirm the language on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is the language in the GST outcome. Whilst it was historic because it was the first time fossil fuels were mentioned, there were a lot of problems and loopholes. So there's no vehicle for that to be strengthened out of this COP because there was no agreement. Several other things fell when that decision fell, including a reference to the sort of nature, climate, biodiversity link in the GST outcome, where they talked about protecting, conserving and restoring ecosystems. So that wasn't, again, reaffirmed or mentioned. In terms of going forward, so this work program, it's 2 years, so they can continue at the Subster and in Belém next year, and there'll be a lot of push for having that fossil fuel phase out language strengthened. My understanding was the failure to actually get language out of the G20 that was happening at the same time played into that problem, and so it's a bigger sort of geopolitical issue as to whether countries will move forward on that language.
Okay, great, thank you. That's very helpful. You just might want to, so GST is global stocktake, which is this mechanism under the Paris Agreement, whereby is it 5 years, Kate? Every 5 years. Basically, the governments naturally determine contributions regarding mitigation and other matters is looked at in aggregate, and to see where it sits and what the mitigation gap is in terms of what the science target is telling us. And the idea was that by doing that stocktake countries would have to see how they would have to ratchet up their mitigation contributions to close the mitigation gap. So a big part of that ratcheting was a decision at the previous COP last year to be transitioning away from fossil fuels. But there's certainly, so in terms of the most critical strategy question, to me, that's really the most critical one here. So are there any other questions? We're at 1:15 in Queensland at least. I can't see any posted. No more hands are going up. Well, thank you very much for joining us today, and please join me in thanking Christoph and Kate and Lilia for their insights and contributions. We'll be having another CAB webinar series in 2025, including one with the Griffith Asia Institute at the end of next year to talk about what happened at COP30. So I look forward to seeing you all online next year, and have a great Christmas break and summer holiday. Thank you very much.